Yeah, there was some technical issue last time, so I couldn't complete the CNS infections. But what I thought is because it's a massive topic, let us split into two. One is meningitis, and second is going to be encephalitis and other infections like brain abscess. So when it comes to meningitis, we're going to discuss about the acute meningitis, which can be bacterial or viral or something else, but mostly it's going to be bacterial or viral. Then we have subacute forms of meningitis, where you're going to get that cryptococcal meningitis, tuberculous meningitis, and all. But in countries like India, TB meningitis is so common. And then we have a real specialist topic in the form of chronic meningitis. So this is not very commonly seen, but there are numerous etiologies that can produce chronic meningitis. Trust me, there are so many etiologies that can produce chronic meningitis, but it's a real specialty topic and it's not commonly seen in practice. Mostly it is handled by neurologists. So first, let us finish off the most common ones, that is acute and subacute meningitis. So meningitis is nothing but a purulent, infection of the meninges and the subarachnoid space. It's going to involve meninges and the subarachnoid space. In case if it's going to involve brain parenchyma, this is also called as meningoencephalitis. Okay. If it's involving only meninges and subarachnoid space, it's meningitis. If it's going to involve brain parenchyma, it will be called as meningoencephalitis. And what are the evidences that the brain parenchyma is involved? Three important evidences. One is altered mental status. Second is seizures. And third one is going to be focal neurological deficits. So these are the three important evidence of encephalitis, which means that the brain parenchyma itself is involved. Okay. In that, what do you mean by bacterial meningitis? It's an acute purulent infection in the subarachnoid space with CNS inflammatory action, which means it's just a purulent infection because it's bacterial at the end of the day. So what is the epidemiology? In the West, it's around 1.5 cases per 1 lakh population. The most common pathogen is going to be pneumococcus, that is Streptococcus pneumonia, but it can be meningococcus in approximately 25% cases. Group B Streptococcus is quite common in very young population like infants and newborns, but it can occur in older adults also who are immunosuppressed. And Listeria monocytogenes is going to be seen in 10%, but who are going to be at risk of Listeria-related meningitis and thromboencephalitis? Those who are less than 5 years of age or more than 50 years of age, those who are immunosuppressed, and those who are pregnant individuals. These are the ones who are going to be at risk for Listeria monocytogenes. And trust me, Listeria is the #1 cause of thromboencephalitis in the world. And Haemophilus influenza in the post-vaccination era, it's very, very difficult to see. But yes, we do see some cases of Haemophilus influenza type B as well, but it's very rare nowadays because of vaccination. So epidemic-wise, if you ask me which meningococcus and which bacterium is going to present in that way, it's going to be meningococcal meningitis. That is, Neisseria meningitis causing meningitis is going to present in an epidemic pattern, especially in those adolescents and young adults who have recently left the home or entered hospitals and dormitories or sometimes in military recruits. So because it's going to occur in people with closed community. So Neisseria meningitis, and these epidemics have an interesting pattern. They're going to recur once in 8 to 12 years. And what are the key risk factors? When it comes to pneumococcus, the most important risk factor is associated pneumonia, associated ENT problems like sinusitis, otitis, or alcoholism, immunosuppressed states like diabetes, and that splenectomy becomes very, very important because post-splenectomy opportunistic infections mostly will be comprising of capsulated organisms like pneumococcus. CSF leak is also a very, very important risk factor. Don't forget that I've seen plenty of cases. Complement deficiency generally will not lead to pneumococcal infection, but mostly it will lead to meningococcal infection, at least in exams. Mortality rates of pneumococcus is around 20%. That is 1/5 of the patients generally tend to die. And after, it's going to be more common in people who are more than 20 years of age. So it's going to be common in proper adult life only. And as I mentioned, it is important risk factors going to be complement deficiencies, especially the terminal complement pathway, C5 to C9, terminal attack complex. So if that is deficient, any of the complement in that is deficient, it's going to result in very high risk of meningococcal infection. Or complement inhibitors, like for example, eculizumab, ravulizumab, these are anti-C5 monoclonal antibodies. These drugs carry a very high risk of fulminant meningococcemia because they inhibit the terminal complement pathway. Right? That's the reason why before giving eculizumab, it is mandatory to vaccinate against meningococcus. And it can also be seen in adolescents. It's very common in adolescents and young adults, as I said in the previous slide itself, because it's going to occur in the form of epidemics, especially in closed population, and especially those who are in the hostels and dormitories or probably military recruits. As I said, it's going to occur in epidemics. Vaccines are there, but it does not cover the group B meningococcus. And the meningococcal rash can occur in 20 to 50% cases, especially in the setting of fulminant meningococciemia with bilateral adrenal hemorrhage because of DIC, that is called as Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome. And group B streptococcus is going to occur in very young individuals like infants and newborns. But nowadays, we are increasingly seen in adults and especially those who are immunosuppressed and 50 years plus. Listeria monocytogenes, as I said already, extremes of age, like less than 5 years, especially less than 1 year, or even neonates, or more than 50 to 60 years of age, immunocompromised people and pregnant individuals. And it's a foodborne infection. And again, you need to know that it's the most common cause of rhomboencephalitis in the world. Gram-negative bacilli meningitis are very, very rare. So, but you can expect in the setting of post-neurosurgery. And in that case, I'm going to think in terms of Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Sometimes you can suspect after trauma also, but these are rare conditions that can result in gram-negative bacilli causing meningitis. Staphylococcus means it must be Staph aureus or Coagulous negative Staphylococcus, but it's generally very rare. It will be usually occurring after neurosurgery or trauma, and it can be due to device-related infections also, like shunts, cardiac implantable electrical devices, Ommaya device, where there is a catheter that's going to be helpful in introducing drugs into the intrathecal space or removing CSF. So that's an Ommaya device. And Haemophilus influenza is quite common in unvaccinated children only. So in the post-vaccination era, it is very, very rare. But still, majority of the non-B strains are emerging in the recent past. That's a big threat to the community right now. But again, number one is going to be pneumococcus, followed by meningococcus. These two are going to be the most important. And what about the pathophysiological mechanisms? First, it's going to be the bacterial colonization and entry. Once it enters CSF, there's no immunity within the CSF because CSF per se doesn't have that much cells. The normal cells will be less than 5. And of course, they're very less in protein. So there is no much immune response from the CSF. So then you are going to get the inflammatory response. Once the bacteria releases the cell wall components, then there will be more and more inflammatory cells recruited in that area. And that will produce so much of cytokines. Because initially there was no much immunity within the CSF, the organism proliferates rapidly. There will be rapid multiplication. And once the immune cells enter that area and see there will be so much of organisms, they're going to mount a lot of immune response, resulting in too much of inflammation in that area. And that inflammation is going to ultimately lead to edema. There are a lot of different types of edema like vasogenic edema, cytotoxic edema, interstitial edema, and so on. And once edema sets in, once ICP rises, you're going to have hydrocephalus, and raised ICP itself is going to be a problem, ultimately leading to herniation and death. And patients can develop a lot of vascular effects as well. Like, for example, patients can develop vasculitis, thrombosis, loss of cerebral autoregulation, and that can further lead to ischemia, infarction, and hypoperfusion to the brain. So you can remember in 4 simple steps: bacterial colonization entry, inflammatory response, lots of edema, and there'll be some vascular effects in the form of vasculitis and thrombosis of the vessels as well. So what are the clinical signs? The most important is going to be the classic triad of meningitis, which is nothing but fever, headache, and neck stiffness, which is seen in more than 80% of adults. And altered mental status can be seen in more than 3/4 of the adults. It can range from lethargy to coma, and seizures are usually seen in 15 to 40%. Focal seizures are going to be common in patients who are having ischemia, that is strokes, and generalized seizures are going to be seen in patients who are having hyponatremia. Both of ischemia and hyponatremia can occur in the setting of meningitis. And patients can have raised ICP signs also, and that can be seen in more than 90% cases. So what do you mean by raised ICP in the setting of meningitis? If the pressure in the CSF is more than 180 millimeters of water or more than 20 centimeters of water. The normal CSF pressure is somewhere around 50 to 180 millimeters of water. That's why if it's more than 180, you can call it as raised ICP. And signs of raised ICP will be papilledema, 6-nerve palsy, which is a false localizing sign, and Cushing reflex, which is nothing but a triad of elevated blood pressure, high bradycardia, and there will be altered respiration, also irregular breathing pattern. So this is what we refer as Cushing's reflex due to raised ICP. Herniation can occur in 1 to 8% depending on the stage of presentation. And one specific clue that I want to mention is the meningococcal rash, which is going to be maculopapular initially, and then it can turn into petechial and purpuric rash, and it's going to be more commonly seen on the trunk, extremities, and the mucosa. And it can be seen in approximately 20 to 50% of the cases, especially because of the DIC caused by fulminant meningococciemia.